Tina, what's wrong with you? Why are you throwing up? You must tell me what's wrong with you today.
Tina sat on her bed, staring at the ceiling. She felt scared. Something was wrong. It had been 2 months since her last period, and she had been feeling sick every morning. Her best friend, Bella, sat beside her. "Tina, are you okay?" she asked. Tina sighed. "Bella, I think I might be pregnant." Bella's eyes became big. "What? Are you sure?" "I don't know," Tina whispered. "But my stomach feels weird. I feel tired all the time, and I throw up every morning." Bella grabbed Tina's hand. "You have to tell your mom." Tina shook her head quickly. "No way. She will kill me." "But, Tina." "No." Tina cut her off. "Please don't tell anyone." Bella sighed. "Okay, but you can't hide this forever." Later that night, Tina sat at the dinner table with her family. Her mom, Mrs. Johnson, was serving food. Her dad, Mr. Johnson, was reading the newspaper. Her little brother, Jake, was playing with his toy car. "Tina, why aren't you eating?" her mom asked. Tina forced a smile. "I'm not hungry, Mom." Mrs. Johnson frowned. "You haven't been eating much lately. Are you sick?" Tina quickly shook her head. "No, I'm fine." But just then, her stomach turned. She covered her mouth and ran to the bathroom. She threw up. Her mom followed her and knocked on the door. "Tina, what is wrong?" "Nothing, Mom," Tina whispered, wiping her mouth. Mrs. Johnson didn't believe her. The next morning, she woke Tina up early. "Get dressed. We're going to the clinic." Tina's heart pounded. "Why?" "Because I want to know why you're always sick," her mom said firmly. Tina tried to think of an excuse, but there was no way out. She had to go. At the clinic, a nurse took Tina's blood. "We will get the results soon," she said with a smile. Tina sat nervously. Her mom kept looking at her. Minutes later, the doctor walked in with a paper in his hand. He looked at Mrs. Johnson and spoke slowly. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter is pregnant." Silence. Mrs. Johnson's face turned red. "What?" she screamed. Tina looked down, tears filling her eyes. "Who is the pig that got you pregnant?" her mom shouted. Tina's hands shook as she picked up her phone. She dialed a number. "Hello. You need to come. Now." Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms and tapped her foot. "We will see who this person is." Tina wiped her tears. She knew things were about to get worse. Tina sat on the couch, holding her phone tightly. Her heart was beating fast. Her mom stood in front of her, arms crossed, eyes full of anger. "Who did this to you?" Mrs. Johnson shouted again. Tina didn't answer. She just kept looking at the door, waiting. Mr. Johnson, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "Tina, tell us the truth. Who is responsible?" Tina took a deep breath. "He's coming." An hour later, the sound of a car engine roared outside. It was loud. Too loud for their small, quiet street. Jake, Tina's little brother, ran to the window. "Mom, Dad, there's a red car outside. It looks like the ones in movies." Mr. Johnson put down his newspaper. Mrs. Johnson frowned. "A red car?" The car stopped in front of their house. The doors opened, and a young man stepped out. He looked tall and handsome, wearing a black suit and shiny black shoes. His gold wristwatch sparkled in the sunlight. He had dark sunglasses on and walked with confidence. Mrs. Johnson gasped. Mr. Johnson sat up straight. Jake's mouth dropped open. The man walked up to the door and knocked. Tina stood up and opened it. "Good evening," the man greeted, stepping inside. His voice was deep and calm. Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms. "Who are you?" The young man removed his sunglasses slowly. "I am the father of Tina's child." The room went silent. Mr. Johnson frowned. "And what do you have to say for yourself?" The man smiled. "Your daughter told me about the problem. I can't marry her now because of my family issues. But I promise I will take care of her for the rest of her life." Mrs. Johnson scoffed. "Oh really? And how do you plan to do that?" The young man took a step forward. His voice was steady. If she gives birth to a girl, I will buy her a mansion, 2 jeeps, and give her $1 million. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson looked at each other. If it's a boy, I'll buy her houses in the countryside, 5 jeeps, 2 big factories, and put $5 million in her account. Jake gasped. Whoa. That's a lot of money. The man continued, if it's twins, I'll do anything she asks. Mrs. Johnson's mouth opened, but no words came out. The young man looked at Mr. Johnson. But if there's a miscarriage, what do you suggest I do? The room became very quiet. Everyone waited for Mr. Johnson to speak. Slowly, he stood up, walked to the young man, and patted him on the shoulder. My son, he said, if there is a miscarriage, you'll sleep with her again. Tina gasped. Mrs. Johnson fainted. Jake fell on the floor, laughing. The young man stood still, confused. Excuse me? Tina couldn't believe what just happened. And she knew, this was just the beginning. The room was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The young man blinked. What did you just say, sir? Mr. Johnson smiled and patted his shoulder again. You heard me, my son. If there is a miscarriage, you will sleep with her again. Tina's eyes widened. Dad. Mrs. Johnson, who had just woken up from fainting, collapsed again. Jake rolled on the floor, laughing. Dad, you're too funny. But the young man was not laughing. His confident smile faded. He cleared his throat and adjusted his suit. Sir, I don't think that's how it works. Mr. Johnson shrugged. In my house, we don't waste investments. Tina covered her face with her hands. This is crazy. Bella, who had just arrived and stood by the door, whispered, your dad is wild. Mrs. Johnson finally sat up and grabbed her husband's arm. Are you out of your mind? Our daughter is pregnant, and you're joking about this. Mr. Johnson smirked. Who said I was joking? The young man took a deep breath. Sir, with all due respect, I came here to take responsibility. But this is not part of the deal. Mrs. Johnson folded her arms. Oh, but you were quick to make all those big promises. Mansions, jeeps, millions of dollars. But now you're scared. The young man hesitated. I am not scared. Then what's the problem? Mr. Johnson interrupted, raising an eyebrow. The young man sighed and looked at Tina. Tina, are you okay with all this? Tina didn't know what to say. She felt like she was in a dream, a very crazy, unbelievable dream. But before she could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. Bang, bang, bang. Everyone turned toward the door. Who could that be? Jake whispered. Mr. Johnson walked over and opened it. 3 tall men in black suits stood outside. Their faces were serious. The tallest one stepped forward. Sir, our boss wants to see you. Now. Tina's stomach dropped. The young man clenched his jaw. I knew this would happen. Mrs. Johnson whispered, what is going on? Tina's heart raced. She had a feeling that this was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. The young man then turned to Tina. You need to come with me. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward. No way. My daughter isn't going anywhere. The tallest man gave her a sharp look. This is not a request. Mrs. Johnson's lips trembled. Mr. Johnson looked at the young man. Who are you, really? The young man took a deep breath. Then, he removed his sunglasses and looked straight at Mrs. Johnson. Her face went pale. She gasped and covered her mouth. No. It can't be, she whispered. Tina frowned. Mom, what's wrong? Mrs. Johnson's hands shook. I used to work for his family. They are powerful. Dangerous. The young man smirked. Yes, Mrs. Johnson. And now, your daughter is carrying my child. Jake's eyes widened. Wait, does that mean my sister is having a rich gangster's baby? Bella whispered to Tina, girl, you're in deep trouble. Mr. Johnson folded his arms. So, you come from a dangerous family? And you got my daughter pregnant? The young man sighed. I didn't plan for this to happen. But I will take responsibility. Bang. One of the black-suited men hit the doorframe. Enough talking. Let's go. Tina felt her stomach twist. Where are we going? The man's face remained blank. To see the boss. A black limousine was waiting outside. The air was heavy with tension. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. Tina sat in the black limousine, her hands shaking. Her parents sat beside her, silent and tense. The young man, now serious, sat across from them. The three men in black suits sat in the front, driving them to a place none of them knew. Bella had tried to follow, but the men stopped her at the door. "This is family business," they said. Jake waved as they drove off. "Bye, rich gangster baby," he shouted. Tina sighed. "This is a nightmare." The limousine pulled up to a giant mansion. It had golden gates, tall walls, and security guards everywhere. Mrs. Johnson whispered, "I told you, this family is powerful." The young man looked at her. "And dangerous," he added. A butler in a sharp black suit opened the car door. "The boss is waiting." Tina stepped out, her legs weak. Inside, the mansion was even more luxurious. Chandeliers, gold-trimmed walls, and paintings of people who looked too serious to ever smile. At the end of a long hallway, a large door opened. A deep voice called out, "Come in." Tina, her parents, and the young man entered. Behind a massive desk sat an older man in a suit. His hair was silver, his eyes sharp. He stared at them for a long time before speaking. "So," the boss said, his voice cold, "this is the girl carrying my grandchild." Tina swallowed hard. The boss looked at his son, the young man who had promised her mansions and millions. "You were careless." The young man lowered his head. "I know, father." The boss leaned back in his chair. "You know what this means, don't you?" The young man nodded. "Yes. I will take responsibility." Mr. Johnson clenched his fists. "What does that mean?" The boss smirked. "It means we will make a deal." He turned to Tina. "You are now carrying the heir to our family." Tina blinked. "A chair." The boss stood up. "If you give birth to this child, your life will change. You will be protected. You will be rich beyond your dreams." Mrs. Johnson gasped. "Are rich?" The boss's eyes darkened. "But if anything happens to this baby," he paused, his voice turning deadly, "there will be consequences." Tina felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her father stepped forward. "Are you threatening my daughter?" The boss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not a threat. It's a promise." Tina's hands trembled. She looked at the young man, who now seemed smaller under his father's gaze. She had no idea how she got here. One minute, she was a normal girl. The next, she was trapped in a world of wealth, power, and danger. And now, her unborn child was the center of it all. Would she survive this? Or was this just the beginning of something even worse?